Okay, so the first video for the front and back envelope wallet will cover cutting out the pattern pieces, cutting the fabric, cutting the interfacing, and fusing the interfacing. So the very first step is to print your pattern pieces. Several of these are rectangles, so I did also put the measurements on the pieces. If you'd rather cut the rectangles out without printing the pattern pieces, you could do that. I would still recommend printing out the card slots panel for these measurement lines for where you will make the folds when you iron it. The ID window frame, this inner rectangle, this acts as a template to trace that. And then a couple of the pieces that are not rectangles, such as the main panel exterior, the flap lining, the facing, and the stabilizer piece. All of those I would definitely use the pattern piece for since they're not rectangles. And then I also have on the very last page labels. Since everything is rectangle, it can get confusing as you go. So I went ahead and made these labels so you can cut these out and pin them to the pieces, so that way when you're doing the sewing, you remember what is what. All right, so the first thing when you print, you want to take a ruler and measure the 1-inch squares on each of the pieces to make sure that it measures 1 inch. So I just lay my ruler over it and make sure that they exactly measure 1 inch. And you'll check each one of them. Alright, so then the next thing you'll do is cut the pieces out on the solid lines. All of the dashed lines that are here are either fold marks or something that you'll trace onto the pattern later. Do not cut those out. So I just have some Fisker scissors that I use for my paper cutting. And I'm just going to cut out a couple of these on the video. You'll notice that some of the pieces have letters, and those are the pieces that will need taped together. So that's what I'll cut out the card slots panel. And you can also do this with a rotary cutter if you prefer, especially since they're straight lines. You could put your ruler on there, and that would be probably quicker. Okay, so I've cut out all of the card slots panel pieces. And then what you'll do for any of the pieces that need taped is you will match up the matching letters. So A to A, B to B. You just butt the lines up to each other, and then you will tape them together. All right, and then match the B's. All right. So once you cut out all of your pattern pieces and tape together the ones that need taping together, which would be the card slot panel and the stabilizer piece will need to be taped together also. So go ahead and cut out all of your pattern pieces, tape them together, and then we'll get started with cutting the fabric out. So I have listed on the pattern pieces, as well as the measurements. Here I list what you need to cut. So let's see. 1 lining, 1 fusible woven interfacing. So each pattern piece has listed on it what you cut out of it. I also have on page 2, I believe, yes, page 2 of the pattern, there's a cutting list, and it will list by fabric type. So it lists everything you need to cut out of the exterior fabric, everything that needs cut out of the lining fabric, the woven interfacing. So that way, if you want to follow that, I'll print that off and then I check it off as I go. So that way I know I have all my pieces cut. So I have for this wallet chosen this out of print Tula Pink Acacia, I believe is how you say it, that I have. I'm going to use that for the lining. And then I have this Cotton and Steel, these octopus, let's see, it's called Tokyo Train Ride by Sarah Watts. So I'm going to use that for the exterior. And this is actually not quilting cotton. It's, I can't remember what it's called, but it's thinner. So I will keep that in mind when I interface that piece. All right, now I want to point out to you on the finished wallet, this pattern piece, this piece here is called the, let's see, exterior accent panel, which is here, and this is cut out this way. For this, you can use exterior fabric, but you can use a contrast like I have done here if you choose. For the wallet I'm making today, I'm going to actually use the lining fabric for that fabric because I think these go together really well. So, if I go over, this is the exterior main panel, exterior accent panel. The card slots panel, which is cut out of this piece, are these. This is the ID window, the ID slot backing. Lining, should have had a list ready for this. Let's see, this is the flap lining here. Card slot back number 2 is this piece. Card slot back number 1 is what's actually on the back. Main panel lining is this piece here. And then the zipper pocket lining is obviously inside the zipper pocket. And then the stabilizer piece is slid in at the end and it's inside here. And that just makes everything, it gives the wallet firmness. So, all right, let's get started cutting this out. I just lay out my fabric, and obviously you can do this however you like to do it. You can pin your pattern pieces onto the fabric and cut them out with scissors. You can trace them on with an erasable marking pen of some sort. I have this Dritz chalk pencil that I really like. And I have some different pens that I use. Obviously they're not over here, so, oh, here we go. I have these friction pens that I use. If you mark on something that's going to show, if it gets cold, this comes back even though it irons away. So don't mark in any place that will show on the finished wallet. My preferred method, though, for cutting out my pattern pieces is to use the rotary cutter. So first I'm going to trim the bottom of this fabric so that it's a nice straight edge. I should have ironed it ahead of time, but I didn't. Let's see, this is like backwards for me. Alright, so I have a nice straight edge there on the bottom, and now I will place my pattern piece on, line it up with that straight edge, and the straight edge on the side. I have too much stuff in my way over here on the side. Alright, I'm going to place my ruler directly over top the pattern piece. And this way I know that it will be nice and straight. And then I'm just going to trim around that. Just make sure you keep your fingers out of the way. Alright, so here's my card slot panel. I don't think there's anything really special about cutting out any of these pieces that it needs to be on video. I will point out how I do the interfacing. So this is Pellon Shape Flex, and when I went and bought it, they didn't have white, they had black, and it actually turns out I really like the black better. I'm going to trim off these jagged edges that I have. So I'm going to start with a nice straight edge. And when you cut this interfacing, you'll cut it out according to the pattern piece size. And if this wallet's something that you're going to make several of, you may want to print an extra set of the pattern pieces just for the interfacing, because you trim 1/4 of an inch off all of the interfacing pieces to keep the interfacing out of the seam allowance. And since the wallet is so small, it can get bulky. So once I cut out that interfacing piece, then just go in here and trim off 1/4 inch from each side. Since these are rectangles, you could just cut a 1/2 inch off each long, or not each long side, one long side and one short side, but for it to be not confusing, I'll just go in and trim 1/4 inch off each edge. And you do that with all of the woven interfacing pieces. So like I said, that if you're going to make several of them, it would be easier just to print an extra set of pattern pieces and have them trimmed, and then just cut your woven interfacing out to the correct size right away. Okay, and then once you have that trimmed down, you'll go to your ironing board, and this will just be centered like that, 1/4 inch from each edge. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out all of the pieces. I don't feel that that needs to be filmed, and then we'll pick back up over. Oh, here's the point. So I have both of my card slot lining panels cut out. So here is the point where I would go ahead and cut out this card slots panel pattern piece label, and just go ahead and you can pin it to that, so that way you know, obviously this is the only long piece like this, but for some of the other rectangles, they're very similar in size, and that way you won't get things confused. So I would go ahead and pin that on at that point. I'm going to go ahead and cut out the rest of this, and then we will be back at the ironing board to fuse the interfacing. All right, now let's get the interfacing fused to our fabric pieces. So I went ahead, and each pattern piece, I have the interfacing and the fabric that goes with it pinned together with the label, so that way I know what everything is. This is especially important when you cut the interfacing, since you're trimming 1/4 of an inch off each side of the interfacing. It's not going to be the same size. So this way it's easier to keep track of everything. So I'll just unpin one at a time, center my interfacing on the back. For Shape Flex anyway, so fusible woven interfacing, you're supposed to have it damp. You could use steam. I don't feel like steam, this shrinks when it's wet, so I don't feel like steam is enough, and I prefer to spray it. And also my steam doesn't work on my iron because it leaks, so I just press that well from the wrong side. Make sure you place your interfacing glue side down to the fabric, otherwise you'll have interfacing stuck to your iron. And then I just press from the right side as well to make sure it's fused well. And then I'll do that with each piece. Some of the pieces won't have interfacing. Oh, and then once you fuse that, go ahead and pin that label back to it. So that way as you sew, you know what pieces you have. So some of these some of the pattern pieces don't have an interfacing piece, and I'm still going to go ahead and press those now, just so that everything's nice and flat when I sew. That will help my wallet to look nicer at the end. It's easier to work with. If you have a heat press or steam press, you could use that to fuse your interfacing. I do, but for the sake of videos, I always do it manually. Alright, as I was saying before, my main panel exterior fabric is not a quilting cotton. It's like an apparel woven fabric, so it's a little bit lighter than quilting cotton. So the interfacing piece for that, I did not trim the seam allowance off, just because it's thinner. So normally you would trim the seam allowance from this piece as well. But if you're using something more lightweight than a quilting cotton, you'll want to leave it. Well, and then also if you have a design that you want to fussy cut, just make sure that one of the ends, this will be like the flap on the front. So it could be either end. So just make sure that you center the fabric how you want. And then this will be the part that shows on the bottom. So it will look like somewhat like that once it's finished. So keep that in mind as you cut your fabric. Alright, so I'm going to just finish fusing all of these pieces, ironing the ones that don't have interfacing to fuse to them. When you get done, you will have this one facing piece will not be fused to anything, and you'll have your firm stabilizer, the Decovil, that will also not be fused to anything, and those will get fused during the sewing process. So make sure you still have those not attached to anything. Everything else will have the interfacing, whatever pieces have interfacing to be fused to them will be fused now in this step.